Live for God Studio Productions.
This is Living Power with Dan Hurst.
Understood. When he says love your neighbor and hate your enemy, to them that made sense. But Jesus says, you have heard it said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, and now he comes along with a whole different concept. And that was stunning. Jesus' statement was that we should demonstrate God's love even to our enemies. That wasn't even taught in the Old Testament. It doesn't say in the Old Testament you're supposed to love your enemies. So this was new to them. All of a sudden, wait, what? We know we're supposed to love our neighbors, and we're told, or the law is, that we're supposed to hate our enemies. But you say, no, we're supposed to love our enemies? And he goes on to teach that God's love is such that he loves even our enemies. And he says he causes his sun to rise on them, and he sends rain to produce their crops. And since his love extends to everyone, we too should be a channel of his love by loving others, by loving all. And such love demonstrates that we are God's children. So this was very novel for them. This was new. This idea that we weren't supposed to hate our enemies, but rather we're to love our enemies. How does that happen? Now, earlier Jesus had said in his teaching in Matthew chapter 5, verse 16, he said, "Let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven." Now, when Jesus said, "Let your light shine before others," what he was saying was that you're to live out your righteousness before everyone, not just the people that believe the same way you do, not just the few that are close to you, not those that are walking in step with you, but you are to live out your righteousness and let your light shine before others, before everybody. To me, one of the most amazing examples of Jesus doing this was when Jesus was on the cross. He was killed on the cross by his enemies, and he's quoted as saying, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." And we've all heard sermons on the 7 last sayings of the cross and all the things that Jesus said, and we just sort of assumed that he just said those things one at a time during his time that he was on the cross. But that's probably not the way it happened, because "Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they do" is written in the imperfect tense in the Greek. And that means that Jesus probably kept praying that over and over and over again. And so he probably kept saying, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." And I can almost imagine that it was happening while the iron spikes were being driven through his hands and his feet. And that he just said that because of the incredible pain that he was dealing with, but he was praying for his enemies during that time. Now, if Jesus could pray for his enemies during that cruel torture of crucifixion, what pain and what pride and what prejudice would justify our silence? I mean, really, if Jesus can pray for his enemies at that time, why can't we during our everyday lives? We're not going through that kind of suffering. Pray for your enemies. Now, I want us to go through this passage, and I want us to break this down and look at it and find the practical application for all of this. Remember that the theme here is that the law can't fix the reason for the law. And that's what Jesus is explaining over and over again. The law doesn't save you. The law doesn't make you righteous. All the law does is it creates a boundary, but it doesn't fix the root problem. And the example that we've given is like today, we have laws in our country that you can't rob a bank. But the law doesn't stop people from wanting or from having that attitude of robbing a bank. It just says just because there's a law that says don't rob a bank doesn't stop people from robbing banks, does it? So the law doesn't really fix the problem. Now, there was a reason that the law, love your neighbor, was given in the Old Testament. It wasn't just to be nice to your neighbors, because Lord knows that's really almost impossible. So where was this idea, love your neighbor? Why was it a law? Remember that when the law was given, these people were living in very close quarters. I mean, they were just bunched together. And they were still a tribal and somewhat nomadic society. And in many cases, they still lived in what we would call tent cities or refugee camps. It was that kind of a setting. And so this law, love your neighbor, meant something more than just simply appreciate your neighbor. It meant be proactive in connecting, caring, and being compassionate for your neighbor. So it was more than just feeling good feelings for your neighbor and being nice to your neighbor. And, if the trash blows over in your yard, you're going, I'll get it, and just be nice to them. It was more than that. It was being proactive in connecting and caring and having compassion for your neighbor. I would suggest that we need that law today as much as ever. We live in a society where people don't know their neighbors. We're not connecting and caring and being compassionate for our neighbors. But see, the law, love your neighbor, doesn't fix the reason for it. What we need to do is take a long, deep look inside of us and determine why we aren't connecting and caring and compassionate for our fellow man, especially those who are physically near us, our neighbors, our co-workers, our family, our communities. Why aren't we loving them? Let me ask you something, and I want you all to be completely honest about this, okay? We're fewer in number here, and I won't tell the rest of the people when they come back how you voted. So be very, very honest. How many of you know the name of your mayor? Would you raise your hand? You know the name of your mayor. It's amazing that most of us don't, isn't it? How many of you know the name of your chief of police? Let's see your hand. Probably firsthand, don't you? Some of you. There was only about 9 or 10 of you who raised your hand there. Let me ask you this. How many of you know the name of your neighbor that lives 2 doors down from you in either direction? A few more. But still, only about half of you. And by the way, that's not uncommon. Most of us don't really know the people that surround us. We don't really know them that well. And what we are discovering in our own lives is that for so many of us, and me included, our immediate neighbor has become a wall to hide us from the other neighbors. We get to know our immediate neighbor, person that lives next to us, but we don't get to know the next neighbor or even the neighbor after that. As you can imagine, if I had said 3 doors down or 4 doors down, the number would have gone down all the time. But they're still neighbors. They're still part of our lives. They're still in our community. And so we use our immediate neighbor as a wall to hide us from the next neighbor. And the reason that people build walls around their homes and their communities and cities is because they consider the people on the other side of the wall to be a potential enemy. Now, obviously not everyone is an enemy, but just to be safe, because we don't always know who our enemies are, we build walls. Physically, but also emotionally, mentally, and a number of other ways. A few years ago, I went back to Tegucigalpa, the city where I was raised in Honduras, and I went to find the house that I had lived in most of my time down there, and it was out in the country when we built. And so I thought, well, this will be, I know how to get right to it, And when I got there, it was all grown up, and there were houses everywhere, and every house had a wall around it. Every house had a wall completely around it. And it was so much of well, the situation was that I never found my house because there was a wall around it. I couldn't see where it was. And I could go to the street that I thought was there, but I couldn't determine where that house was. And the reason people build walls around their houses is because they want security. They want safety, of course. But they do it to keep people out. But part of the problem with building walls is it also keeps other people from connecting with you and being compassionate with you and caring for you. Jesus said, love your neighbor and your enemy, the person that's on the other side of the walls that you've built up. You are to love the person that is on the other side of the walls that you've built. And that includes the neighbor down your street, the neighbor across town, that neighbor in the part of town that nobody goes to because it's so dangerous. That's still a neighbor. Many of you remember Robert Kane from our church. Robert and his family lived here. Robert sang in the choir, had a voice like butter. And Robert and his wife Darlene moved to St. Louis. And so, but before they moved, Robert and I got to be pretty good friends. And he lived down on Benton Boulevard. And he had been doing some work on his house, and they was telling me about it. And it was interesting to me what he was talking about. He said, well, why don't you come over and take a look at it? I said, okay. So I went to his house on Benton Boulevard. I love that area of town. I mean, the old houses, it's gorgeous down there. I mean, you know, my parents actually at one time lived somewhere around the Paseo. And that whole area was just gorgeous. And now it's considered a dangerous area. You know, you don't go there, it's dangerous. Well, I don't care. It doesn't matter to me. You know, I don't think of it that way. So I went to Robert's house, and he said, let's go sit on the porch. So we sat out on the porch. It was a beautiful day. And this car drove by, and he says, watch this. That car's going to come back around here in just a minute. And I said, we kept on talking. Sure enough, that car came driving back around. And then another one came by, and he said, watch, that car's going to come back around too. Watch this. And it came back around. And I wasn't really thinking anything about it, but pretty soon he kept saying, see, that car came by the third time, you know, then a fourth time, you know. And I said, well, what's the big deal? And he says, the big deal is we don't have white people coming down here. So here I am sitting out on the front porch. It didn't even occur to me. It didn't even dawn on me that was an issue. And so we went to a diner just a few blocks away, walked into the diner, and I'm telling you, as soon as I walked in the diner, dead silence. And you know what I did? Hey, who died? Of course, Robert just started laughing, you know, and he knew most of the people. He introduced me, and, you know, we just had a great time. It was really great. But I thought to myself, isn't it sad that existed, that happened, that incident happened? And the reason it happened was not because they had built a wall, but other people had built a wall around them. So you don't go there because that's dangerous. And so other people sometimes build walls around us because they don't want to connect, or they don't want to care, or they don't want to be compassionate. And so there are different ways that walls get built between neighbors, between people. So what does this mean? What does this mean to love your neighbor? We've defined the practical application of love as allowing God to do something in someone else's life through you. Now, the word, of course, is agape. In this particular case, it's agapao. But the root word is agape. We know that word. And we refer to that as God's love, or the God's kind of love.
On behalf of Dan Hurst and the Open Class, we want to thank you for watching. We hope it was a blessing.